My name is Marcus, and I was never one for superstitions. But the night I worked alone at the Royal Cinema, everything I believed about the world changed. The Royal Cinema was an old theater, one of those historic landmarks that had somehow survived decades of decline. I had taken a job as a projectionist there during the summer, and most nights, it was quiet and uneventful. The place had an air of nostalgia, as though it were frozen in time, with its velvet seats and faded golden curtains. The kind of place that people romanticized but never really visited anymore. On this particular evening, the theater was empty. No customers, just a faint hum of the ancient projectors working overtime. I was tasked with running an old film, real one that hadn't been played in years, tucked away in the archives. I set the film up in the projector, a massive dusty machine with gears that seemed too complex for its time. The film itself was in poor condition, the reels yellowed with age. As it began to run, I noticed the film's title, The Projectionist's Curse. I had never heard of it. The footage was grainy, flickering in and out. The opening scene depicted the inside of an old cinema, very much like the one I was working in. The camera moved through the aisles, past the seats, and then focused on the projection booth. I watched, intrigued, as the figure in the film, a projectionist, much like myself, went about his work. But something felt off. The projectionist in the film wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows of the booth, stood a figure, a man dressed in black, his face obscured by a hood. The projectionist seemed unaware of him, completely absorbed in his task. As the film continued, the mysterious figure grew bolder. He started to move around the projection booth, silently watching the projectionist work. The man never spoke, but his presence became more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something that had been recorded with an unsettling purpose. Then, the film took a darker turn. The projectionist, my supposed counterpart, seemed to grow more erratic. His movements became jerky, his eyes wide and frantic. The man in black began to follow him, his steps slower, deliberate. Suddenly, the film stopped. The screen went black. I sat there, frozen. My hands instinctively reached for the projector's control to rewind the reel, but something stopped me. A cold breeze swept through the booth, and I heard a whisper so soft. I wasn't sure if it was in my head, or if it had come from the room itself. "Don't rewind." My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, expecting to find someone behind me, but the room was empty. No one had entered the booth. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder, as if coming from every corner of the darkened cinema. "Don't rewind. You're next." Terrified, I ripped the film from the projector and threw it into the trash. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though something was closing in on me. Suddenly, the doors of the booth slammed shut. The lights flickered, and I was plunged into darkness. The projector started up again on its own, the reel beginning to play the film once more. The screen flickered to life, showing the projectionist from the film, now frantic and panicked. He looked straight at the camera, his eyes wide with terror. Behind him, the man in black was no longer just watching. He was standing in the doorway of the booth, staring directly at me. His face was shrouded in shadow, but his smile was unmistakable, malicious, and far too wide. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was right behind me. I could feel his breath on my neck. The projector turned off. The screen went black. I was alone, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A name scrawled in the dust on the floor. Marcus. I left that night and never returned. I quit my job the very next day, but sometimes, I swear I can still hear the hum of the projectors calling me back. My name is Lucy, and I've always loved the quiet, serene atmosphere of old theaters. That was until I encountered something in the abandoned cinema downtown, a place I was hired to clean up. The building had been empty for years. The owner had passed away, and the theater had been left to rot. The seats were torn, the screens covered in dust, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. But there was something haunting about it, the kind of beauty that makes you feel both drawn and terrified at the same time. One evening, I was hired to clean the theater before it was to be auctioned off. I arrived at dusk, the golden light casting eerie shadows across the broken floorboards. The air was still, except for the faint sound of the wind rattling through the cracks. I began with the main hall, sweeping up the debris and wiping the layers of grime from the seats. As I worked, I noticed that the rows of seats seemed wrong. They weren't arranged in the usual pattern. They were spaced too far apart, and some of them appeared to be facing the walls instead of the screen. Shaking off the odd feeling, I continued my work, but then something strange happened. The projector in the corner of the room turned on by itself. The faint click of the film reel starting up echoed through the theater, followed by the sound of a distant melody, soft, haunting, and almost familiar. Curious, I walked toward the projector. The screen flickered, and an old black and white film began to play. It wasn't a movie I recognized, but it didn't matter. The longer I watched, the more it felt like I was being pulled into the scene. The film depicted a theater, not unlike the one I was standing in. The seats were full of people, their faces blurry and out of focus. But the longer I looked, the more I realized none of them were moving. They sat perfectly still, staring at the screen, their eyes lifeless. I turned around. The theater was empty. There was no one else in the room with me. Yet I had this strange sensation that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The film on the screen continued, showing the audience growing in size, their faces becoming clearer and clearer. The camera focused on one person, an older man, dressed in black, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were locked on the screen, and he appeared to be smiling. A twisted grin that made my blood run cold. I felt a chill run down my spine as the man's face slowly began to turn towards the camera. His smile widened, impossibly wide, until it stretched from one side of his face to the other. And then, just as the camera zoomed in on him, his eyes locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of chairs in my panic. The film stopped, and the theater went silent. I looked around again, heart racing, but this time, the seats weren't empty. They were filled by the very people from the film. They were sitting in perfect rows, facing me, their eyes wide open, their mouths frozen in those eerie grins. I ran as I bolted for the exit. The doors slammed shut in front of me. I pounded on them, shouting, but no one came. The only sound was the distant hum of the projector, still running. I was trapped, surrounded by the silent audience, staring at me as if they were waiting for the next show to begin. My name is Ben, and I thought I knew every inch of the old movie theater I worked in. The seats were worn, the curtains had long since lost their luster, but it had a charm that made it unique. The kind of place where old films were cherished, not just watched. One night, the owner, Mr. Jacobs, called me into his office. He looked troubled. "Ben, there's an old film reel in the back room. It's been sitting there for years, untouched. I don't know where it came from, but I feel, I feel like it's wrong to show it." I was curious. Old movies were always my thing, so I decided to take a look at the reel. The canister was dusty, labeled with nothing but a number, 317. No title, no description. I asked Mr. Jacobs if he knew anything about it, but he just shook his head, clearly unsettled. Despite his warning, I couldn't resist. I decided to play it. The theater was empty that night, just me, the projector, and the ancient film. As the reel began to spin, the image that appeared on the screen was grainy, black and white, just like the kind of old film I expected. But then things started to feel strange. The film seemed wrong. It was a recording of the theater itself, exactly the way it looked. The seats were filled with shadows, though no one was there. As the film progressed, the camera seemed to zoom in on something familiar. It focused on the very seat where I always sat during my breaks. But in the film, there was someone sitting in it. A person with a pale face and empty eyes. They were staring directly at the camera, or perhaps at me. I froze. This was not just an old film, it was a recording of the theater, with me in it, sitting in the exact spot I always took my breaks. I reached for the rewind button, but the projector wouldn't stop. The film kept playing. The shadowy figure on the screen began to move. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, like it was being controlled by some unseen force. The figure slowly stood up and began to walk down the aisle, getting closer and closer to the camera, and to me. I turned around, expecting to see the figure in the theater with me, but no one was there. I turned back to the screen, my heart pounding. The figure was now at the edge of the screen, its eyes locked onto mine. Then, something impossible happened. The screen flickered, and I saw my own face staring back at me, pale, wide-eyed and terrified. I stumbled back, the reel spinning out of control. I tried to shut it off, but nothing worked. The figure in the film began to speak, though its voice was distorted and distant. "Ben, you're part of the show now." Before I knew it, the figure lunged out of the screen, grabbing me by the shoulders. I screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the endless loop of the film, the same scene, playing over and over, with me trapped in it, forever. My name is Evelyn, and I've worked as a projectionist for as long as I can remember. It's not glamorous work, but I love it. There's something magical about seeing a film come to life on the big screen, even if most people don't appreciate the behind-the-scenes magic. A few weeks ago, I was hired to work the night shift at an old theater on the outskirts of town. The building was historic, run down, but still holding on to its charm. The owner, a quiet man named Mr. Parsons, was a bit eccentric, but seemed harmless enough. He welcomed me with a polite handshake and told me, "We don't get many visitors these days, but I'm sure you'll enjoy the peacefulness of the place." I wasn't worried about the lack of customers. In fact, I found it peaceful. The smell of stale popcorn, the hum of the old projector, the flickering of the film, it was calming, but something felt off. Every time I loaded a new reel into the projector, the images on the screen seemed slightly different from what I remembered from the last film. One night, I stayed late after finishing my usual shift, curious to see what was in the film canisters I hadn't yet opened. The lights in the theater flickered as I popped the lid off the first reel. It wasn't one of the usual old films they showed. It was black and white, grainy, and unmarked. Something told me not to watch it, but I put it in the projector anyway. The first frame appeared on the screen, a close-up of an empty chair in the middle of the theater. The next frame showed the chair with a shadow sitting in it. Then another shot, this time from the back of the theater, showing a figure in the seat. My heart skipped a beat. I paused the projector, feeling uneasy, but when I tried to rewind the film, it wouldn't budge. The reel spun faster and faster, and the images on the screen began to distort. The figure in the chair grew clearer. It was a man, but his face was too blurry to make out. Suddenly, the image on the screen changed. It wasn't a film anymore. It was the actual theater, showing me sitting in the projection booth. My skin went cold. I saw myself exactly as I was looking at the screen in disbelief. The figure on the chair now had a face. His eyes were hollow, his skin rotted, and his lips were stretched into a grotesque grin. He stared at me through the screen, his gaze piercing through the fabric of reality. The whisper started softly, but it grew louder and more frantic. "You're next," it hissed. I rushed to turn off the projector, but it wouldn't stop. The reel kept spinning on its own, showing images of me walking out of the booth, down the aisles, and into the seat in the front row. The figure's grin widened, and I could hear his breath, ragged and labored, as though he were sitting right beside me. Panic set in. I grabbed the film reel and yanked it from the projector. Silence fell over the theater, but when I turned to leave, I froze. There, sitting in the front row, was the same figure from the film. He was real. His hollow eyes glared at me, and his mouth stretched into that same terrifying smile. I ran, but the doors wouldn't open. I turned around, and the figure was closer now, standing at the top of the aisle. His grin grew wider, and then he spoke. His voice was a low, guttural rasp. "You're part of the show now, Evelyn. I've been trapped in this theater ever since." The film reel never stops spinning. Every time the lights flicker, I hear him behind me, whispering my name. As I sit in the front row with all the other lost souls who've watched the film and never escaped. My name is Tom, and I'm a film historian. I work at a small, obscure library that houses old cinema archives. Over the years, I've come across some fascinating films, forgotten gems, long-lost reels of classic cinema. But there was one that I wish I had never found. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the library, hidden behind several dusty boxes. The film reel was sealed in a plain metal case, without any label or markings. The moment I saw it, something felt wrong, like it didn't belong. The film wasn't listed in the catalog, and no one seemed to know anything about it. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to watch it. I set up the projector late one evening, when the library was closed, and began the screening. At first it seemed like a typical black and white silent film from the early 1920s. The story was simple, about a man who enters an old, abandoned theater and begins to explore the hidden rooms. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it, but as the film progressed, I noticed something strange. The man on screen wasn't just an actor, he was moving unnaturally, as though he was aware of the camera. At first I thought it was just part of the film's art direction, but it became more unsettling as the story unfolded. The man's gaze began to fixate directly on the camera, his eyes wide, almost pleading. As the man explored the theater, the scenes grew darker, more distorted. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deeper, the sound of creaking doors and rustling whispers becoming louder. It was as if the theater was alive, and something was waiting for him. The more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't a film about a man exploring a theater. It was a man trapped inside the film, trying to escape. I tried to stop the reel, but the projector jammed. The film continued playing on its own, the images flashing quicker, the man's expression growing more desperate. His movements were jerky, frantic, as though he was trapped within the frames, desperately trying to reach the audience. Then, as he turned towards the camera, his lips parted, and he whispered one word: "Help." The screen flickered, and the image distorted. The man on the screen reached out his hand, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull me into the film itself. I yanked the plug, and the film stopped. The projector shut off, and the room fell into an eerie silence. My hands were trembling. I turned to the screen, half expecting to see the man staring back at me, but the screen was black. The reel was completely blank when I checked it. No images, no footage, just empty film. I've never told anyone about that night, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the library late at night, I hear faint whispers and feel eyes watching me from the shadows. And every time, I wonder, was it just a film, or was I the one trapped inside it? My name is Lucas, and I've always been fascinated by cinema. I work as a cinematographer on independent films, struggling to make a name for myself in the industry. One night, I was offered a mysterious opportunity that seemed like a dream come true, to work on a legendary director's final project. The director was reclusive, rarely seen by anyone. His films were groundbreaking, yet no one knew where he'd gone after his last movie years ago. Rumor had it that his obsession with perfecting the art led him to disappear, and some whispered that he was dead. But one fateful night, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was gravelly, old, and haunting. "I need you for my last film," the director said. "Meet me at my studio, and bring your skills. Time is running out." The studio was located in a forgotten part of town, nestled between decaying buildings. When I arrived, the place looked like something out of a nightmare, a massive, empty building, its windows boarded up. The door creaked as I stepped inside, and the musty smell of old film reels filled the air. I was greeted by a lone man, hunched over a desk filled with storyboards and cameras. His face was gaunt, pale, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "You're here. Good," he rasped, standing up. "We've got much to do." He handed me a script, its pages yellowed and worn. The story was simple at first. A group of filmmakers trying to finish a documentary about a haunted location. But the more I read, the stranger the script became. The lines of dialogue seemed to change every time I read them. The setting of the haunted location was described differently, and scenes shifted, becoming more sinister and surreal. I started to feel uneasy, but the director insisted we begin immediately. As we filmed, the set grew more bizarre. The lighting flickered, casting unnatural shadows. The air became colder, and I could hear faint whispers between takes. When I looked at the footage on the monitor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figures in the background, previously empty. Spaces began to move, and figures with ghostly faces appeared, staring directly at the camera. "Don't worry," the director said, not looking at me. "It's part of the process. We're capturing the truth of this place. The spirits are becoming part of the film." As the night wore on, I began to feel like I wasn't just working on a film. It was as if I had entered the story itself. The walls seemed to warp, the lights began to buzz and hum, and a feeling of dread settled over me. The air grew thick with something dark, something ancient. At one point, I looked away from the camera, and there, standing in the corner of the room, was the director, or at least, it looked like him. His skin had turned translucent, his eyes sunken. The ghostly version of him grinned at me, his lips pulling back in an eerie smile. Then he whispered, "I never left." The real director had vanished. Panicked, I tried to escape, but the door was locked. The set had transformed into a labyrinth, twisting and turning with no way out. The monitors showed images of the studio, but they were distorted, showing figures that weren't there before, flickering in and out of existence. I ran, but no matter which direction I went, I ended up back in the same place. Then, I heard the sound of a film reel spinning, the haunting voice of the director speaking again. "You're part of it now. I've never left the studio. I'm still here, trapped in his final film, a ghost behind the camera. And every night, I hear the whispers of the crew as the lights flicker and the film continues to play, showing things that were never meant to be seen." My name is Sarah, and I used to work at a small independent cinema. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I loved the atmosphere, the smell of popcorn, the hum of the projector, the dim lights. The theater was always quiet, with only a handful of loyal moviegoers. But there was one thing I never expected, a movie that was never meant to be shown. It was a Wednesday night, when the manager came up to me and handed me a film reel with no label, just a plain white wrapper. He told me it was a special, rare screening for a select group of people. He'd received a mysterious email, and this film was to be shown only at midnight. No exceptions. He insisted that I play it, no matter what. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't say no. As the clock struck midnight, I loaded the reel into the projector. The film started without a sound at first, just blackness. Then, slowly, images began to appear on the screen. It was a series. of seemingly random shots: an old, abandoned house, a flickering streetlight, an empty room with a single chair. Nothing made sense, but I couldn't look away. The silence was unbearable. There were no sounds or voices, just the eerie visuals. As the scenes continued, I started to notice something strange. In every frame, there was a shadow lurking just out of focus. It moved ever so slightly, as if watching me. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, the footage changed. The shadow in the background became clearer. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, moving closer to the camera. I looked up at the projection booth, but everything was dark. The machine hummed softly, but there was no one around. The figure on screen began to take shape. It was a person, wearing a tattered suit, their face obscured by shadows. As it stepped closer, I could see the outline of its eyes, empty black holes, staring directly into the camera. And then, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't be watching this." I froze. The voice was clear, coming from the screen, but there was no one in the theater except me. I reached for the control panel to stop the film, but my hands were shaking. Too much. The figure on the screen stepped forward, closer and closer, until it was right in front of the camera. Suddenly, the room around me began to grow cold. I looked around, and I swear I could hear faint whispers, as if people were speaking from the darkness. The figure reached out towards the screen, its fingers elongating, stretching out of the frame, into the theater. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The figure's hand passed through the screen and touched the glass of the projector. And then everything went black. I woke up the next morning in the theater, the projector running, and the reel still playing. The room was empty. I checked the film, but it had burned out, completely ruined. There was nothing left to show. I never saw the manager again. No one talked about that night, but every now and then, when the theater is empty, I can still hear those whispers, and I know that whatever was on that screen, it's still watching. My name is Eliza, and I had always been fascinated by classic cinema. That's why, when I heard about the reopening of the legendary Sterling Theater, I couldn't resist. The place had been closed for decades, ever since a terrible accident occurred during a midnight screening. They said the film that played that night had cursed the theater, but I didn't believe in such superstitions. It was just an old story. After all, I was one of the few who showed up for the grand reopening. As I walked in, the old velvet seats, the grand chandelier above, and the faded posters brought back a sense of nostalgia. But something about the place felt off. The air was thick, and the faint smell of old popcorn and dust clung to everything. I took a seat in the middle of the theater, eager for the show to begin. As the lights dimmed, I felt a chill in the air. The screen flickered to life, and the opening credits rolled. But it wasn't a classic film I had expected to see. It was a new release. The title was The Silent Screen, and the cast looked unfamiliar. The movie started, showing a woman entering a cinema. She sat down, much like I had, and watched the screen. But then, things took a strange turn. The woman on the screen began to notice that she was no longer alone in the theater. The seats were occupied by empty figures, their faces blank and lifeless. Staring at her, I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. My eyes darted around the room, but I couldn't see anyone else. The theater seemed empty, despite being full. When I entered, then the woman on the screen turned to the camera, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. "They're all around me." A soft rustling sound echoed in the theater. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like someone was moving in the row behind me. I turned slowly, but there was nothing there. The screen flickered again, and now the woman was walking down the aisles of the theater. I watched, entranced, as the shadows around her stretched longer, more sinister. She turned to face the camera, her voice trembling as she said, "There's no escape." The theater grew colder. I shivered and looked around. The empty seats now seemed to loom closer. A figure was sitting just 2 rows behind me, its face pale and featureless, like a shadow carved out of light. I stood up, ready to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, as if the screen had taken hold of me. The whispers around the room grew louder. The figures on the screen were no longer still, they were moving, walking toward her dot, and then, with a final chilling scream, the woman on the screen vanished. The theater plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, I was still sitting in my seat, my hands clutching the armrests. The theater was empty. There were no other patrons, no staff, just the empty, lifeless chairs, all facing the screen. I quickly grabbed my bag and rushed out, my heart pounding. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The Sterling Theater was gone. Only the sign remained, now broken and flickering in the dark. And on the screen, in the theater, a new message appeared. You're next. My name is Alex, and I had always dreamed of working at a movie theater. When I landed a job as a projectionist at the old downtown cinema, I thought it was the start of something great. The theater had been around for decades, and despite its age, it still had a loyal following. Most people just came for the films. But I soon learned there was much more to this place than meets the eye. The theater was known for showing rare, hard-to-find films, many of them from the golden age of cinema. But there was one film that no one spoke of, The Black Reel. It was said to be a cursed film, and no one had seen it in years. The rumors about it were dark, and the previous projectionists warned me never to play it. But one night, curiosity got the best of me. I was the only one in the building that night. The usual crowd had already left, and I had the place all to myself. As I walked into the projection room, I noticed the dusty box on the shelf. It was labeled The Black Reel. I hesitated, but I couldn't resist. I loaded the film into the projector and hit play. The images on the screen flickered to live-fold, grainy footage of a small town. The people in the film seemed oddly lifeless, their expressions vacant. It felt wrong, like something was lurking just beyond the camera's reach. As the film continued, I started to feel uneasy. The images began to distort, the people on screen moving in unnatural ways. Then, in the corner of the screen, a figure appeared. It was barely visible, just a shadow, but it was watching, waiting. I tried to turn the projector off, but the switch wouldn't work. Panic set in as the shadow on the screen grew larger, closer. The sound in the theater became muffled, like I was underwater. My heart raced as the figure on the screen started to move toward the camera, its eyes locked on mine. Suddenly, the screen went black. The projector kept running, but there was nothing but silence. I rushed over to the machine and tried to stop it. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the controls, but just as I was about to turn it off, I heard a whisper, soft but clear. You're not supposed to watch. I froze. The voice came from behind me. Slowly, I turned around. A man was standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes empty like he hadn't blinked in years. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 1920s. He stepped forward, his voice rasping as he spoke again. You should have never played it. Before I could move, he lunged at me, his cold, clammy hands wrapping around my throat. I struggled, but my body wouldn't respond. The darkness of the room closed in, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the flickering screen, showing a single frame of a smiling figure, a projectionist. When I woke up, the theater was silent, and the projector had stopped. The man was gone. I stumbled out of the projection room, my hands still shaking. But when I looked up at the screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The credits of The Black Reel were still rolling, and at the very end, a name appeared. Alex, the last projectionist. My name is Eric, and I work the night shift at Kingpin Bowling Alley. It's an old place, barely staying in business, and no one ever comes in after midnight, or at least, no one living. Last Friday, around 2 a.m., I was cleaning up when the lane screens flickered. A name appeared on lane 6. Graham. There was no one in the building but me. The ball return rumbled, spitting out a single black bowling ball. My breath hitched. Kingpin had a story on urban legend, really about a man named Graham who bowled a perfect game just before he vanished without a trace. Some say his body was never found. Others claim he's still here, playing frame after frame in an endless loop. I told myself it was just a glitch. I had two choices: ignore it and leave, or watch. Morbid curiosity won. The ball rolled down the lane, slow and deliberate. No one had thrown it, but it moved anyway. It struck the pins a strike. The machine reset, and the screen updated too. Frame 2. I watched as the game played itself. Frame 3, frame 4. Every shot was perfect, but as the frames progressed, the atmosphere changed. The lights dimmed, the air turned stale. I heard something faint, a whispering sound, just behind me. Frame 7. The whispers grew louder. My hands clenched around the mop handle. The lane's wood looked warped, like something beneath it was pressing upward. Frame 9. The screen flickered again, this time displaying a message. Join me. I turned to run, but the floor was sticky, like something was holding me in place. The final frame played. The ball rolled, slower this time, like it was dragging something with it. As it hit the pins, a shape emerged from the ball return. A figure. His skin was gray, stretched too tight over his skull. His eyes were empty sockets, his mouth frozen. In an unnatural grin, the name on the screen changed. Welcome, Eric. Frame 1. I bolted. The exit door wouldn't budge. My reflection in the window wasn't mine, it was his. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed a ball and threw it down the lane. My hands shook, but I aimed straight. A strike. The figure stopped. The lights flickered. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything was normal again. The lane screen reset. The name was gone. The ball return was empty. I ran home that night and never went back. But last night, outside my apartment, I saw something. A single black bowling ball, and it was rolling toward my door.